Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church. And I'll say up front, I'm running way behind this week. So I'm going to keep this part short and sweet. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already, or follow our podcast, give us a positive review, or just maybe a helpful one, an honest one at least. You should know that this podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. You can check them out by visiting www.wishtv.com/podcast, and there you'll find an assortment of podcasts made in Indiana that cover a wide variety of topics. They really do run the gambit. And lastly, and I know I'm doing this quickly, bear with me. If you miss something and you're interested, you can rewind it. But lastly, if you want to reach out to me for a comment or to connect, I'd encourage you to write into my email, my personal email, which is my name, Heath, at indyncc.org. That's Heath at indyncc.org. Moving on, and I said we'd be quick. It's now time for us to pause for a brief ad break. If you're watching this on YouTube, you probably already know the drill. There will be no ads for us. So we're not that popular on YouTube. But there will be ads for our podcast audience. So without further delay, here are some ads. And we're back. Today, we'll be considering a story found in the very beginning of the first gospel. The first gospel that is written anyway. You'll see that Matthew is listed first in your gospel, but Mark was written earliest. Biblical scholars believe in a consensus sort of way, so very little doubt about that. But we're going to be reading from this gospel in the very beginning of this gospel, more specifically Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And I'll not beat around the bush. It reads, "The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. The whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went out to him, confessing their sins. They were baptized by him in the Jordan River. John wore clothing made of camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. And this was his message: after me comes the one more powerful than I, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." Of all the Gospels, Mark spends the least time waiting for the narrative to really get going. You may notice that there is no nativity story here, no story of Jesus' birth, as is the case with Matthew and Luke. Mark doesn't open with a lengthy philosophical or theological reflection, as is the case in the Gospel of John. Instead, he begins almost at it seems like in the middle of nowhere, but really at the start of Jesus' ministry. He begins with a picture that if I were writing a book, I probably want to put John the Baptist on the cover. There were no covers back then, but these are the opening lines about this man, wild and ruly. He's unsightly, he's intense. I've always thought of him as uncouth, living in the wilderness, feeding off of wild honey and bugs, locusts. But for Mark, this is just where to begin. This is where the gospel, or the good news, begins in Mark's gospel, because in one sense, John the Baptist may reflect some of what was wrong in his day. So his very inclusion is something like an analysis. Here is a poor man traveling the Judean countryside. He may not be uncouth by choice. It could be that this is all he has and all that he has to do. In fact, who would eat locusts for fun or wear camel's hair? Perhaps others walked past John the Baptist, as one might, a panhandler who appears out of sorts, perhaps even dangerous, you know the type. Who knew that this ragged man contained within him the Spirit of God? And who knew that this man, in fact, contained within him the hope and vision that the human race desperately needed and still needs? I wonder how many in his day discounted him just because of how he looked or what he said. Would you or I have? I think, actually, if we were being honest, very possibly, which does raise questions for today. What prophetic voices in our own times do we ignore or discount because they come in the form of the sorts of messengers we've come to expect to ignore? For, after all, we don't expect strong voices, spoken with confidence from maybe someone like John the Baptist, as we find here. We expect a strong message coming from the mouth of someone we respect, from someone who seems important. And then when they speak, I try and listen. I may not even really know who they are, but I listen if they seem important. But the model of the Bible, as seen here, is basically the ones God calls to speak into time, place, and a specific culture, is very much not someone a culture is likely to respect. And there is a good reason for this. I think this may be part of the reason. One reason being, if the culture already liked and agreed with what the prophet, in this case John the Baptist, had to say, or the message that they embodied, then the prophet would hardly need to express it, would they? You wouldn't need John's loud mouth, or if they did, it may only need to be said one time for the people to hear it, receive it, and then be changed by it. But if you can discount the voice of the prophet by way of prejudice, then you can excuse yourself from not having to listen to their voice. And at this point, you might say, no, not me, prejudice? I'd never. And I don't necessarily mean racial prejudice here. That could be part of it. I mean, John was a brown, olive-skinned man from the Middle East. But it's not always a part of the prejudice we hold. I'm talking about all of the prejudice. I'm talking about any reason why I might prejudge someone like, say, John the Baptist. He may come across as mentally ill, such as maybe someone you might find wandering the streets nowadays. I've met them before, sometimes even preaching an urgent message, and I usually blow quickly past them. But to write off John because of his appearance here would be a grave mistake, because anyone who did would miss this good news, and we don't want to miss it either. Which leads me to another point. While some might have written him off for his appearance, still many others dismissed him for his message. I'll allow one of my Bible professors, Dr. Ron Allen, to summarize this gospel's perspective and the one that John the Baptist may have brought. He writes, For Mark, the gospel is the news that God is ending the present broken age and will replace it with a refurbished world, or the realm of God. End quote. And of course, that would be good news for someone like John who was poor. That present broken age referenced there was not working well for him and many others in his community. That's why he became a firebrand. But there were others who heard this message that John brought and received it as, well, not good news, but bad news. And it may seem like a bad thing for the present age to end if you can't, for the life of you, find anything wrong with it. I'm now thinking of people I know who can't see past their own material comforts to notice that this whole thing is propped up on unjust economies across the globe. Yours and my creature comforts are well enough on their own. Nothing wrong with them. That's not my point. But they become idols when we cannot see past them and take notice of John, his voice, and his message. A cry for help, a cry of hope in a desperate place. And then if any of this resonates, perhaps it's time for us to try and to clear out our ears and remove the prejudice from our eyes so that we can finally access John's message and see what in the world it needs to address. It is a message of hope, a hopeful message, centuries old by the time John spoke it, perhaps older. And the message in today's story is basically, help is on the way, says the wild fellow with the unkempt hair and wearing animal skins. He's telling anyone who will listen, help is on the way. So he wants us to wake up to it. What is coming? But then consider, what would you do if some crazy-looking guy like John came up to you proclaiming, good news, coming to you from who? Him? But for John, the goodness that was on the horizon was as certain as anything. That's how he was able to speak with such conviction. And so he invited those near him into baptismal waters, offering them a chance to turn from their complicity in the human systems that cause harm, him and others, and into the ways of Jesus, the way of radical compassion, a way where we reject our love of wealth, which used to be called greed, and a way that calls us to love and reconcile to our enemies. So first, here's an opportunity for each of us to take stock of our lives, our motives, our passions, our actions, and determine if there are ways and perspectives that we need to turn away from so that we can lean fully into the life Jesus calls us to. The life that John is telling us is on the way, the help that we need. If you are feeling this way in this moment, please pause this and chase down that feeling. It could lead you to profound revelations about yourself, and if so, remember the source. Remember, this hope was brought to you today by a man wearing animal skins, a homeless man who eats bugs. I wonder who else might have a message we need to hear. There again lies the prejudice that we must let go of. So now let's pause for a second, assuming you're back or maybe you didn't leave us, and ask ourselves this question. Could it be that there are prophetic voices around us that we cannot hear? I spoke earlier of prejudice, just brought it up again, and I'll admit it. Sometimes it is hard for me to recognize that God's messengers often come in forms I don't expect. In fact, sometimes God speaks through people we are primed and ready to reject. And if they're coming with a message of hope and help, we'll miss it. I've mentioned poor people. Now, here's a broad category. It most often means poor in a material sense, someone who's broke and with very little means or resources. It can also refer to those who are rich materially but are poor spiritually. Either way, Christians are called to help them. Or if that describes you, John the Baptist has told us that this whole enterprise, this Christianity, is bringing you this help. So we are tried to help. So I've tried, and I think my mistake has been of late that I try to show up as the voice. I've showed up to help, assuming myself to be in the role of some modern John the Baptist, or if not John the Baptist, some lesser messenger who has maybe some of the answers. This is hubris I'm describing. It comes from me sometimes. When I first came to Indianapolis, I joined with something called the Poor People's Campaign, which is a movement still ongoing, which you should support. Look it up. Anyway, when I first joined, I expected that my credentials as a pastor, a seminary graduate with a master's degree, sometimes wear a robe and fancy occasions, I thought that these things would buy my voice purchase in those settings. I assumed that those around me, some of whom were very poor, some looking not much more put together than, say, John the Baptist, well, I assumed that I had the help for them. But I was quickly humbled. I did have moments in which I was invited to speak. I think I've helped some, but by and large, the people who spoke there publicly and most prominently have been poor people. People like John the Baptist, disenfranchised people. I saw one woman who could not afford groceries for her children stand and speak bravely in front of a crowd right downtown Indianapolis by what we call the Circle, explaining to those who would listen the world as she knew it. I saw people who were not dressed very nice because they didn't have anything nice to wear, but who spoke clearly and poignantly of their life circumstances, defying expectations, prejudices we lay on them. They told of homes lost unjustly, relatives dead or dying for lack of adequate health care, parents who've lost their children to street violence, and the list could go on. I can name any number of problems, but in this context that I'm describing, I've heard poor people remind all of us that help is on the way. They've used their own words to tell me this. Those who would seem to have little reason to hope. I've heard it said that help is on the way with as much conviction as John the Baptist, and just as loudly. I've heard it from the mouths of people who, by anyone's reasonable opinion, ought to have given up and have lost hope long before. Last week, I heard it at the first of many gatherings with a group called Faith in Indiana, where I heard people of alleged low station share their stories and reclaim their voice and their sense of worth. And in that room, I was not even close to the one crying out in the wilderness, "Make way, prepare the way of the Lord, help is coming." I was the one hearing it, needing to find faith and believe, as poor people spoke with confidence that their help was on the way. Some, John the Baptist, I turned out to be, I could not say with confidence, even in that moment, that help was on the way. But I heard their cries of hope, and I've started to wonder, is it true? And I'm starting to believe it is. In fact, on my better days, I do believe help is on the way. So was it true for those who heard John shout it out, telling them that their help was on the way? Well, yes and no. John's disciples, and later Jesus' disciples, believed that they would see the full story turn on its head in their lifetimes. It's clear from the early Christian writings that there was not only an expectation that help was on the way, vaguely, but that when it came, all that was wrong with the world would be corrected, and in their lifetimes, all of it, from the top down. Or as it reads in Revelation and the book of Isaiah, more than one place, there will be no more suffering, tears, dying. And that isn't what happened, but their help did come. Jesus arrived, and one of the ways he brought them help way back when was very strange, but an obvious good idea when you stop to think about it. It was very simple, really, although sometimes very hard to do. Here it is. As the help, he called people together. Rather than helping out each one of them individually, something Jesus scarce had time for, I am sure, he called the community together around him to be his hands and feet, his mouth, to be the voice of God in desperate places. He called 12 disciples, then he called more, also poor men themselves, most of them. And they had been looking to him for help, and they received it. But Jesus also opened their eyes to the ways a community can be its own help. It has the ability to, if it has in mind the things of God, that is, if it has in mind the well-being of all of God's children. This really is a two-pronged sermon. One thing I want us to see is that God's help may come in very surprising packages. This means that when someone like a John the Baptist tries to get your attention, we'd better listen. Don't write off anyone for prejudice, for their race, obviously, but also for their poverty and low social class, how they speak, how they present. The fact that we think of one another in terms of class is a large part of the problem. How if John the Baptist were not viewed as a wild and woolly man, but rather our brother, our neighbor, our potential friend? If any of this strikes a chord with you, spend some time after this considering what voices you may be tuning out for your inability to see past a book's cover and into the wisdom contained on those pages. Someone you pass on the street just may embody some of the help you need right now. You'll never know if you never listen or engage or lean in. Listen to John the Baptist and listen to the poor and anyone else struggling to find a voice. And do it for your own sake, not always theirs, assuming that you have the wisdom. Rather, assume that they have some wisdom to offer you. And together, you'll find out how you might be one another's help. The other thing I want us to see and to come to believe with an inner fire and conviction is that our help is on the way. Boy, don't people need to hear it. Christmas reminds us of this each year. And if you're struggling, here I am, standing in the role of pastor, telling you, hold fast to hope. Something is bound to break. This tumultuous and difficult season will not last forever. But also, we are meant to realize that in some ways, our help has already come. We are the church. We are a part of a community who, filled with God's Spirit, brings this help into the world. Historically, churches have started hospitals, food banks, and various charities to answer this call to help, informed legislation in times past, say around the beginning of the 20th century as the New Deal was forming. But we have also forgotten at times that in a world filled with people looking for help, we are called together to be one another's help. As part of the help Jesus brought, he called us into a community that was at that time just forming. I'm speaking here of the church. That's us. And if you are a part of it, you are also a part of the help Jesus brings, an answer for some of the world's problems. Together, though, not alone. Again, Messiah complex. Don't catch it. Because we are, as we would come to be known, the body of Christ. And we are that together. The help, it's in you, or even better, it's in us. For when we are called into community, we are not alone in answering the call to be a helping hand in the world. None of us has all of the help. None of us can take this on alone. And help is on the way. It's both here and it's still coming. So lean into the help that is already here. If you are looking for help, call your pastor, call your friend, call someone who can bring you a message of hope, and perhaps your help will find you. But also, be aware of the ways we bring help with us. Notice what gifts you have to offer others, and then share them. As we grow together in this way, we discover the love of God that is in our midst, that in fact, some of us have received all of the help that we need.